I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm the chair of the Department of Classics and Archaeology, although many of you do not know me, except when I sign off on various change of program forms. But I welcome you all to this event. It will be my last event in the Department of Classics and Archaeology, as very soon, in a few days, the new chair will be Professor Katerina Zakaria, who will be the head of the department for the next 3 years. So I'm very happy to host or to co-host this event, the CLAR Symposium, for all majors and minors in the department, and to be part of the award-giving ceremony, which will follow the presentation by Julia Donahue, the graduating major this semester. So I'll hand the event over to Professor Zakaria now, so that you can follow through with the remainder of the proceedings. Thank you, Katerina.
Thank you, Anya. And indeed, thank you, Anya, for chairing us for 3 years during a number of challenging changes in the department. 2 of our colleagues recently retired. So Professor Bill Fulco and Professor Matt Dillon, and they've been from the beginning with us when we started this symposium 15 years ago. So it is a joy to be continuing this tradition and having our seniors presenting. Normally, this is a time of celebration for us on campus in person with lunch and awards. So hopefully we'll be able to do that pretty soon. This year, we kept it very short exactly because we're all kind of Zoom tired by now. I want to introduce our graduating senior, Julia Donahue, who is a double major in screenwriting and classics and archaeology. Hi, Julia. And Julia attended the course on representations of Greece, ancient and modern, and did something that few students do in a semester: take a capstone, take the class, take an extra capstone research unit, and the extra unit for capstone presentation, which normally we would have take place over 2 semesters. Also, this particular course is challenging in itself in that we only receive the films that we need to analyze quite late. So students receive the links to watch these films probably sometime in March and early April, by which time, of course, Julia had written a lot of essays and sort of implemented theories, social theories we've been doing in class. But the film she decided to do, she started quite late. So I want to commend her on putting all this effort to combine everything she's learned from 2 textbooks and watching a number of films and finally identifying a topic and bringing it to fruition. So I'm very happy to introduce Julia and look forward to this presentation. Julia, the floor is yours.
Cool. Hi, I'm Julia. Let me figure out how to share that. And can I go over to my other screen, and does that change anything? It's all good. You can still see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, cool. For a start, I didn't reference this in the paper, but I feel like my interest was informed by this article I read a few years ago by Kwame Anthony Appiah in The Guardian called "There's No Such Thing as Western Civilization," which talks about the idea of the West and how it was created and how it's a pretty modern concept. So you guys should check that out, because I was making the presentation and I realized I was referencing that even though it was my paper. So wanted to say that. Cool. So West is a pretty modern term, as I just said, and I talk first about how it's like the Western world has come to identify itself based out of Greece. So I talk about the typical Western views of Greece, both classical and modern, and the ways in which the West characterizes itself from, like I talk about how we create meaning out of difference. So the West characterizes itself by its specific distinction from the Oriental world through the virtue of rationality. The ways in which the West has created this self-imposed taboo of the irrational, and therefore a desire to transcend this irrational binary and explore the irrational of the other, and how that's made possible through immersion of the other. And I talk about that specifically through the embrace of the god Dionysus. So I said, like, Foucault's ideas of relationships between knowledge and power and truth are fundamental in how historical narratives are understood. And he talks about, like, conceptualizes what he calls a regime of truth, which is when the knowledgeable and educated in a society can create a subjective truth and support a given narrative. So there's a relation to be drawn here between discourse and knowledge and difference in meaning, which is discussed by Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall introduces in his edited volume Representations, one second, okay, introduces this idea of binary oppositions. And he argues here that we need difference because we can only construct meaning through a dialogue with the other. And I said that that can apply to much of Western discourse, like how the West is unable to define itself, and everybody else, but like this is what my theory is about, can't define itself simply in and of itself, but must be defined through its contrast to other cultures, that most often being the generalized East. And then I wrote this in because this is how it's written in the textbook and it makes it visually easy, but Hall says we should really write like bold, white / black, like men and women, because there's always a power structure within a binary opposition. So we can see how the more powerful pole binary is able to produce knowledge, read Foucault, and therefore control the regime of truth within that group's historical moment. So that can all be directly applied to the West, and the broader Western idea of historical heritage and how the West contextualizes itself within the rest of the world because of that idea. Yeah. And then I turned to Edward Said and I watched his lecture on his book Orientalism. And I combined it with what I had read in this chapter in Professor Z's book Hellenisms, called Dreams of Treasure by Charles Stewart. So Said gives this example about how Napoleon did this survey of Egypt. And like, it wasn't, he said it's like the first important modern imperial survey of a place, because he says there's no comparable Egyptian survey of France, and to produce knowledge you have to have the power to be there and see in expert ways things that the natives themselves can't see. And in Dreams of Treasure by Charles Stewart, he talks about how in the Enlightenment period and the Renaissance, people like from the Western world would come into Greece because they felt that they had such a connection because of, you know, classical education. And the modern, I say modern, but the Greeks living there at the time didn't have classical education available to them and didn't have as much of an identity in classical Greece. And so Charles Stewart talks about how the Ottomans actually thought that the modern Europeans coming in were like descendants of the Byzantines. And it was just interesting because I was thinking about idea of power and how Western Europe was experiencing a Renaissance, and after that the Enlightenment, based directly in a resurgence of identity in Roman and Greek culture that the Greeks at the time didn't, like, subject to occupation, had like no part in instigating and no ability to benefit from. So like as Said puts it, he says like the to see in expert ways through freedom and wealth and education the upper class Westerners had, things that the natives themselves couldn't see, was a privilege exclusive to Western Europeans, in which Ottoman era Greeks could not partake. So yeah, so Charles Stewart talks about this idea of interjective metalapsis, which is a method of splicing the past into the present to create an identity. There's this narrative of historicized continuation that's been created, which connects ancient Greece directly with the modern West. So Greece must necessarily then be us and be part of the self. But the historicization of Greece also identifies it wholly with the past. So it's unable to evolve and therefore is othered through history. And Edward Said talks about that. In Orientalism, he talks about the like timeless phenomenon in his in I just said that in Orientalism, and he says that it's as if the Orient, unlike the West, doesn't develop; it stays the same, which creates an image outside of history. So we recognize ourselves as different culturally from ancient Greece, but also fetishize it as this thought utopia, which is impossible to attain, but desirable to return to. Next page. Okay, yeah. My dad actually sent me this article, How Poetry Won Independence for Greece. And it was written for the Greek bicentennial of independence. And it talks about how Enlightenment Europeans had a huge part in the Greek Revolution. And I was really interested in that because it was entirely because they had this identification with classical Greece. And Saropoulos writes that, like he says, quote, Byron saw in the modern Greeks the flicker of ancient genius fallen upon desperate times. So I said that, like, I read that as that meant for Byron that Greece, the concept of Greece meant something really personal, and then the flicker implies like a flicker of hope, and the ancient genius shows nostalgia for something perceived to have been lost, and then the desperate times implies that these times, like all times, is impermanent, and that Europe basically was giving hope that Europe could like draw Greece back out of like Ottoman occupation into like a glorified Greece again. I said that the flicker was hope, yeah, but not for the Greek people. It's a glimmer of hope for Western Europeans, that they might be able to liberate the underlying genius of Greece, this fetishized genius that they thought that Greeks inherently had, from the oppressor, and induce some times that were perhaps not so desperate. But I thought also that it was really interesting, and this is why when I was making the presentation that I thought again of that article that I didn't include here about how there's no such thing as Western civilization, that there's this quote from Thanos Veramis, this professor at Athens University, who says that, quote, the two great allies of the Greeks are religion and the relationship with ancient Greece. And he explains about Europe's desire to help Greece. He says that images of Christian underdogs mauled by Muslim overlords resounded with Europeans, and that the Europeans were more or less convinced that this was a case of revival for ancient Greece. And I thought that that was really different from the Hellenic nostalgia that it seemed to have fueled the savior complex that Europe had, because it showed the level of self that Europe wanted to identify with Greece, because it was about Christianity, and they were picking and choosing, again with the interjection of metalapses, they were picking and choosing and splicing these pieces of history within a modern European identity, and saying like, oh, Byzantine era Christianity, that's just like us, and also like things like from classical education, they were identifying with us. And so I saw that at first I understood the Western Europeans as seeing the entity of Greece outside of history, but that's not quite the case. I said that the goal of helping with the revolution was not to free a temporarily disenfranchised Greece, which really exists outside of history, but it was to create that Greece, which is to be done through things such as the liberation of its historically Greek territory, the continuation of the Enlightenment, and historical constructivist appropriations of ancient symbols, like how King Otto, who's a Bavarian and German prince, which goes to show that German identity was really steeped in this constructed classical identity. Like King Otto really wanted and did resurrect neoclassical architectural style in order to create a classical identity within his modern Greece. So I said Byron's view of the Greek people shows that enlightened Europe fetishized Greece because of Hellenistic nostalgia, but that's not the only reason, and that the nostalgia alone wouldn't have been enough to rouse Europe to Greece's aid. It's also the religious aspect and the power over the East and the other. So that brings me to this idea of rationality, which is how I think that the West most often bases its identity in regards to an other. I said, one second. Okay. I discussed earlier Stuart Hall's work explaining how human beings create meaning through difference. And that I said we can discuss the ultimate binary that the West uses to define itself against the other, the rational and the irrational. And I feel that so often in the Western world, and specifically the Anglo-American world, we strive for like the refined and the cultivated and the sophisticated, which is a paradigm of rationality championed by the Enlightenment period. And we can see, I gave plenty of examples about historical moments like that, like the infantilization of primitive cultures. I put that in air quotes, but you can't see that, by the West. And this actually I can probably skip over, but like female hysteria, like how women are on the irrational side of the rationality binary and are thus disenfranchised of power, while men are on the rational side of it. But I also say that we have an innate desire to explore any side of another binary. So we've created this taboo of the irrational and led to its fetishization. And I said the West develops a fetish for the experience of the irrational and everything that it consists of, which is like intense emotion, the experience of emotion through the physical body, and the desires of the subconscious, which brought me to Nietzsche, who's a huge critic, I know, of the Enlightenment ideal of rationality. But I was reading The Birth of Tragedy, which had to do, obviously, with Apollo and Dionysus, where he says, I think I have another slide. No, I don't. He says that the continuous evolution of art is bound up with the duality of the Apolline and the Dionysiac through their perpetual conflict. He says that regarding art, they serve two different purposes. Apollo is order, reason, individuality, beauty, creation, sanity. Dionysus is irrationality, excess, intoxication, the chaos of nature that man has made its attempts to evolve from. He's a return to nature and a return to the divine terror of the Titans, which the Olympians evolved from. And so I said that even though we have a desire to achieve beauty, order, and perfection, especially in the Western world, which has really made that its goal, it's the ideal of goodness, humanity doesn't and cannot exist on one side of a binary, and we're always going to have a draw toward the irrational. So I talked about, here we go. Oops, never mind. I'm just gonna stay here. I talk about Dionysus as a god of transformation, which is really what I see him as, because we see him transforming. I talked about the Bacchae. We see him transforming between like human and god, and animal and human, and feminine and masculine. And Dionysus exists to provide a space in society within which a person can submit to the intoxication of the irrational, and become, like, as experienced in the viewing or acting of a tragic play, like intoxicated by the terror of irrationality. And so I said, like, for example, in the Bacchae, Pentheus is more or less seduced by the god, lets him willingly in, and is transformed by him, which results in a loss of his individuality, his masculinity, and his life. And through dramatic irony, the audience is able to watch and experience with full knowledge of what's going on, Dionysus's corruption of Pentheus, and are able to live the terror that Pentheus is blind to before the moment of his death. So the theater is really, for the Greeks, a domesticated space in which one could partake in Dionysus, in the irrational, in a safe way. And in the modern West, which disdains the irrational because it poses no scientific progressive value, the Dionysian nature is stifled and lacks an outlet. And this is where I come to this documentary, Dionysus the Return, which focuses on the work of this theater director who I have pictured here, Theodoros Tsotsopoulos, and his 35-year career dedicated to the Bacchae. He's dedicated his life to the exploration of the body, which he specifies the body with a capital B, and the ways which we can experience emotion and terror and irrationality through the body, and the ways that the process of transformation wrought by Dionysus in the practice of theater defines the dynamics of the body. Dionysus is a god dealing with the subconscious and the experience of physicality, the masculine and the feminine, the transcending of binaries. He offers existence outside of the binary of rationality and irrationality. And so I talk for a while about Tsotsopoulos' play. That's a screenshot from the documentary, which I said is performed for the, not performed for the power that comes from experiencing the Bacchic, but it's an act of submission to the immortal and an acceptance that the trade-off for the divine experience is that one's body is to be dedicated and used for the duration of the dance, the celebration of the play, by the essence of the god himself. And that is an act of communion with Dionysus that I think is very therapeutic, and that is often very suppressed in the Western world, which has no outlet for Dionysian desires and adds into the rampant individualism of the West. I feel like I'm going really slow, but anyway, I wrote that it the actor becomes to relinquish individuality for the controlled duration of the play means that the actor is able to become part of the whole. And I pulled this quote from Nietzsche, but he says, "Man is no longer an artist. He has become a work of art. And to the accompaniment of the Dionysiac world artist, the call of the Eleusinian mysteries rings out." Which brought me to these two other films that we watched for the festival. One of them is Persephone, 2019. Because I began to think also of Persephone and Dionysus as gods who can be paired together. This movie deals with, the movie specifically deals with this Greek family who has a hostel and are hosting these 6 Japanese women. And they are acting out the story of Persephone as it happens to them in real time with this other stranger in the house who is Persephone's uncle. The film is really evocative of theater and Greek theater, and the 6 Japanese women act as the chorus. But I came to view Persephone as a goddess who can be paired alongside Dionysus because they're both gods of transformation. So where Dionysus deals with transformation of the body, Persephone has to deal with transformations of the world and the things that we can't escape. Like I said, she's the explanation of the transformation between summer and winter, and femininity between the succession from girlhood into womanhood, what it means to be on the less empowered pole of the gender binary, and the transformations that happen to women, the transformations between life and death, from which she, a goddess, can't escape due to her detainment in Hades. So I said that there are 2 types of transformations, those which humans desire and crave animality, irrationality, the embrace of the instinctive and raw humanity, and also those which we fear, rape, imprisonment, winter, death, which is the Persephone side. And I said that both these transformations, even though we desire one and fear the other, have to do with the relinquishment of power. I talked also briefly about this short documentary about Eleusis, the city, which has been chosen for the European Capital of Culture for 2021. Which is really, okay, sorry. I am bad at slideshows, so I did a short one because I thought I could talk more. But I talked about how the city of Eleusis is being chosen for the year. Sorry, Eleusis is where the historical city where the cult of Persephone and the Eleusinian mysteries historically were. So that's the relation there. And I talked about how it being chosen as the European capital in 2021 relates to Western identification with ancient Greece and this historical narrative that current Western culture stems from ancient Greece. Yes, 2 seconds. And so I said that the West has created for itself an identity based in perceptions of ancient Greece paused in history, rational, stoic, idealistic. Charles Stewart said that we act in reference to exemplary instances from the past. And I said that Euro-Americans have aimed to do just that, referencing classical Greece as a pinnacle, exemplary, and they've created their own national and cultural identities in a constructed and historically idealized and fetishized version of Greece. I said that Theodoros Terzopoulos, that theater director of the Bacchae, I said that he has come closest, I think, to worship of Dionysus, in that it's not about, like how Nietzsche said that these Olympian gods aren't like deities how we often think of them as deities of goodness, but they're literally the deifications of the most intense human emotions. So he says the Olympians are manifestations of overbringing, indeed triumphant existence, where everything that exists has been deified regardless of whether it is good or evil. And Terzopoulos' work celebrates not necessarily a literal god, but the human qualities and desires that he embodies sublimely deified, which the West is very often lacking. The West has come to suffocate. I said that what Terzopoulos and his dedication to the Bacchae has done is reintroduce this Bacchic celebration and provide a relief from the rationality of the modern world by forging its identity within the supposed superiority of the rational mind above all else. There's been created in the West a hyperbolic desire for transformation across that binary into the irrational. Nietzsche wrote that Apollo cannot live without Dionysus. So I said that wherever desires for the Bacchic are most suppressed in societies, we can see throughout history dramatic countercultures and a drive to experience like the deified irrationality that Dionysus represents and the powerful transformation that one can experience out of Apollo's realm of reality through losing individuality and becoming part of a communal whole.
Well done, Julia. Thank you very much. So yes, indeed. I think one of the ideas that I liked in your paper, Julia, was when you say that Greece and this reading of classical Greece made it othered through its interpretations by the West, so that the Greeks had to appropriate or sort of import views of the West of something that had a fixed identity in a specific time. And so in that Greece is fetishized as an utopia that is impossible to attain, but desirable to get to. So that aspect that you see, I think that was a good way of bringing what you've learned together. I also wanted to say, I'll put on the chat the blog that Julia prepared is opening the master blog for the course. So you have now access to the master blog. And if you go to the page that says student blogs, you will have access to this essay and images from the films.
I'd just like to say congratulations on your excellent presentation, Julia. That was very interesting. And I must say, I had never heard of that concept of prolepsis. Is that it?
It's called introjective metalepsis. And yeah.
That was really an insightful categorization of a phenomenon that I have seen recur, but I have never seen that name for it. I realize now that it's in the literature, but thank you for bringing that to the fore. It was really well adopted, well deployed in your argument. So
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it.
So it comes as Julia was referencing this article that is about dreams, Anya, and it's dreams of treasure. And Charles Stewart is using this theory of how does memory work? And sometimes the memory comes in like flashes. And so she used that, as you said, really nicely to talk about picking and choosing elements to create an identity. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the dream aspect more because that director had talked about dreams he had since childhood about Dionysus, and I wanted to talk about that in relation to this and these dreams that other Greek children had, and also actually Apollo as like a dream god. But I was already at like 7,000 words, so.
Yes, so there was a dream, and I'm entering this because I'm adding this because it's interesting. So this film director walks back after 35 years of devoting his life to making Bacchae and a special acting technique. He goes back to where he grew up and he said, when I was young, I had this dream. And in my dream, I saw these three ladies walking on the ocean. And this is where Dionysus came from the East. So it was very interesting to see that he created a personal dream myth of why he became a theater director and had 35 years of life. And in Charles Stewart, Dreams of Treasure, it was a whole island that had the same dream, trying to create an identity, a national identity, bringing together ancient Greece and Byzantium and modern Greece in one. So that's what Julia liked a lot. And yeah, well, thank you, Julia. At this point, it gives me great pleasure to be able to present to you, Julia, with the Eugene O'Neill Award for the graduating senior best student in classics and archaeology. So 2021.
That was really difficult to achieve. Thank you. The only one, but thank you.
We're very happy, Julia, and I asked Julia because it's the longest piece that she's written, and she was showing me, she draws everything on a piece of paper, so she had mapped out how she's going to come from the beginning to the end and keep on adding, and I said, you need a photograph of that document to share with other students because this work of writing 30 pages.
Don't have a photograph, but it looks like that.
Yeah, so that's something we want to share, that it takes a while and ideas take a long time to for gestation before you can actually create. So congratulations, Julia.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. Congratulations, Julia.
Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great summer, Julia. And again, we're very happy for having you with us for all this time and for celebrating what you've learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Bye.